All right. Rick says we're on. So good morning, California. Good afternoon, East Coast. Aussies are still in their beds. Good evening, UK, Netherlands, Germany. We're back for another Friday live question and answer. We will not do a question and answer next week. I will be actually in Washington State. I have a synodical deputy thing to do. I'm flying into Portland and then driving to, I think it's Sunnyside, Washington from Portland. So I still haven't firmed up my schedule. I have a Saturday morning appointment at a classis in Sunnyside, Washington. A classis is a Christian Reformed Church meeting where I have to listen to the examination of some new candidates and some other things. So I will not be here Friday morning next week. I will likely be here the week after. So that's the way the schedule goes. Thank you, Rick, for setting all this up. Thank you, Bridges of Meaning Discord, for being present. Thank you for putting questions in here. One of these weeks, I just expect to get here and there won't be any questions. Maybe we'll just have a conversation, but y'all seem to fill up the questions quite readily. So I'll get started. And unlike my usual practice, I don't think I'll spend much time at all in the first question, but there are some links in the question and answer section, which Joey edited a little bit. And this is from a rando that we did a conversation and it wasn't published. And it took me a few minutes to think about who you are. And now I figured it out. So hi, Paul. It's early June rando convo partner here. Sorry, folks, it's not published. I'd say probably about half of my randos conversations aren't published, maybe a third, something like that. After listening to September 10 question and answer, where you talked about circumlocution and how the secularists avoid certain words when trying to describe religious things, can you talk about the toolmakers paradigm that we discussed? I really can't. I don't feel competent to talk about it, but there are some links below. I will say that the video coming out Monday morning is a video where I do some commentary on Jonathan Peugeot and Richard Rowland's latest Universal History video. The first 15 minutes where they talk about principalities. And it's basically, this is going to get into the question that Luke asked later, and basically gets into the question, which is more real? And you're kind of stuck between Aristotle and Plato. Is the ideal the most real? Or let's say in Platonic terms, the form most real? Or is the historical instantiation most real? And anyway, I'll get to that when I get to that question later. So those of you who are curious about the toolmakers paradigm, check out these links that Jay Pineapple Pizza put down below. And I'll leave it at that. He's on Twitter too. And he's often talking about the toolmakers paradigm, but I don't feel competent enough to really present it here. So Justice, question number 2. Have you heard it? You have heard it said, the passage in Acts about the communitarian nature of the church. It's sort of when I was preaching through Acts a few years ago, it's sort of the afterglow of Pentecost. It's the heyday of the church. It's the halcyon days. It's the honeymoon. Are descriptive, not prescriptive. But I ask you, what would it look like for today's church to be faithful to the spirit of these passages? Though we may not follow its letter and all move into communes. And that's partly the point. So you read these two texts, and then you also have to read the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And I think the story of Ananias and Sapphira locates this question properly, in that nobody had to, and it actually speaks very competently to our current situation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the book of Acts, there are these two passages at the end of chapter 2, which is the Luke's treatment of Pentecost, and at the end of chapter 4, which is this story in chapter 3 of Peter and John going into the temple, meeting a beggar. Peter says, "Silver and gold have I none, but in the name of Jesus Christ, stand up and walk." And he does. And that causes an uproar, and that causes the Sanhedrin to take a look at Peter and John, and they give them a scolding. Peter and John give a very famous speech where they basically say, or Peter always gives the speeches because he's the oldest. Peter says, if I've got to serve you, if I've got to obey you or God, and you put this in conflict, God wins. And so they basically release them with a wrist slap. Luke makes a very interesting comment about the religious leaders noting that Peter and John had been with Jesus, and boldness is a very big theme in the early part of the book of Acts. And so then you have these two passages where everybody is selling their property, sharing everything in common. Now, stated as such, it just sounds dramatic and beautiful, and it is. And then you get, if you dig a little bit deeper, like Barnabas is one of those who was noted to have sold property and gave all the money to the church. We're going to follow Barnabas around a fair amount in the book of Acts. Does Barnabas continue to have house and property on Cyprus? Probably. Did he sell his Jerusalem home? Could be. I mean, there's just worlds of information that we don't have in those passages. And then you get to the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And what happens with Ananias and Sapphira is that Ananias decides, now, again, there's lots of Ananiases in the New Testament. There's a prophet in Antioch named Ananias. There's Ananias that goes to pray with Paul after he's blind. So a lot of repeat. It's the George Foreman approach to names. So Ananias and Sapphira. Ananias sells a piece of property, keeps some of the money, gives some of the money to the church, lies about it, and says, "I gave it all." Well, what is he doing? He is trying to gain status by virtue signaling. And Jesus talks a lot about this very pointedly in the Sermon on the Mount. And so part of what you have is this descriptive, outgoing expression of joy and gratitude that you find authentically and seemingly spontaneously in chapter 2 and 4. And in chapter 6, and in fact, the rest of chapter 6 deals with that too, because then you have the distribution of food to the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenistic Jews, the widows, the Hebraic widows and the Hellenistic widows. They're all likely Jews. And then you have trouble there. So in many ways, chapter 6 deals with the very foreseeable consequences of an attempt to literalistically, prescriptively apply the Pentecost heyday on an ongoing basis. This also gets into all questions about eschatology and such. Now, part of the reason I mentioned this, again, the Ananias and Sapphira story has a lot to say about virtue signaling. And it's the spiritual jeopardy that virtue signaling will put you into. And I think if you listen to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, you should be a little bit more uncomfortable with trying hard to suppress the chattering rider on top of the elephant that just is the constant PR person. And we all have this and we all do this. Having said all this, the Anabaptist tradition, for example, one of the real distinctions between, let's say, the Anabaptist and the Magisterial Reformation is that the Magisterial Reformation in very many ways was a deeply cognitive oriented Reformation. And Calvinists in particularly become very hung up with and dedicated to correctness of thought. We want to have our theology right. We want to have our confessions correct. We want to think correct thoughts. Now, part of what I think the Anabaptists really got right was, well, thinking correct thoughts, that's important, but the heart of Christianity is more a life than a list of theological statements. And so how the Anabaptists pursued that. Now, of course, they had thoughts, they had theology, they had all of those, but sort of especially as modernity would get going, and I'll talk in my Monday video a lot about what I'm calling a modernistic physicalist concordism. And Karen Wong on Twitter said, what do you mean by concordism? You have to understand that in the frame of reference of sort of creation science. Concordism are these attempts to try to synchronize physical, what we call within our modernist frame, historical events with the descriptions in Genesis. Okay, that's concordism. And as modernity and Darwinian ideas came to the fore, fundamentalists really worked hard on concordism with respect to the book of Genesis. And that has led to what has been called literalisms with respect to, or taking the Bible literally, all these kind of things. It's really a form of concordism. Modernity is really obsessed with modernistic physicalist concordisms. And you can hear this when you watch almost any historian treat any subject, and they say the magic words, well, we don't know if that really happened. What do they mean by really? And I mean, Jordan Peterson had the same thing when he's talking to Danica Patrick. What do you mean by really? And so a lot of what Jordan Peterson did is sort of disrupt the modernist physicalist concordism that has gripped conservative Christianity and atheist critics for a long time. Jordan Peterson disrupted that, okay? Now, Anabaptism didn't go with had their own form of modernist physicalist concordism, but much more in terms of behavior than propositional thought. And so the Anabaptist tradition worked literally on turning the other cheek, living communally. And they pursued this. And now you can bring Julian in here, what anyone who has pursued communitarian living will tell you is that there's a lot of work to be done in order to actually make that work. That rather simplistic rules, while sometimes are noteworthy and dramatic and can sometimes lead to very dramatic things and good things, over the long haul, distributed broadly in community, are often insufficient. And for this reason, for example, monastics, middle-age, early classical and middle-age monastics developed fairly extensive rules about how to deal with property, living together, behavior. These rules go far beyond what you find, let's say, in the book of Acts or in the book of Matthew. Similarly, one of the earliest Christian documents that we have outside of the Bible, I never know if I'm saying it right. It basically means the Didache. It's this document that is teaching. You can find it on the internet. It's a fairly short document, and it's a fascinating document because it's basically dealing with all the sorts of fallout that sort of a naive embrace of Pentecostal honeymoonism would create. And so what you have in the very early church, apparently, are all these itinerant preachers. I've been talking about the book of Acts with people who come to the church of Antioch and say you must practice circumcision and the Mosaic Code in order to be basically an heir of the Hebrew the Lord's work with the Hebrews and hence the Jews. And that, of course, is the big fight that the book of Acts is about. So you have all these itinerant preachers, and so you get to the Didache, and what that book does is begin to lay down rules about how to deal with those itinerant preachers. And what they often do is sort of extrapolate on some of the rules given by Jesus, and on some of these points in the Pentecostal honeymoon. So I appreciate, I would want to, I wouldn't want to go whole hog and say this is merely descriptive, because I think there is some prescription in it. But I would also pull back from saying it's simplistically prescriptive, that if you just do these things, then somehow the eschaton will break out and everything will be grand. This has been tried. Just read church history. This has been tried again and again and again, and often with wonderful, noble results, sometimes with very painful results. And what seems to be the problem is sort of the formulaic embracing of simple things in order to achieve, basically, to bring heaven down to earth. And I'm very cross-pressured when I say that, because some of the most amazing movements of the church, think about St. Francis of Assisi, some of the most amazing movements of the church have been exactly like this. And they've also been incredibly cruciform, and those things go together. So every now and then, I will find someone, and this is before my internet days, which means that there's a lot of them out there, because if some little pastor on the corner of Florin Road in Sacramento, California, bumps into people with a degree of regularity like this, I will bump into a really sincere Christian who is working really hard to take Jesus seriously, and the form that they are taking is to apply single-mindedly, simplistically, literally, the commands of Christ, and letting the chips fall where they may. With this practice, I have seen some of the most dramatic witnesses for Christ and his power in the world. And I have seen some of the biggest wreckage done by Christians to people around them that they should love. Now, this is a rather foggy thought, but I do recall at college meeting, I was a college student, she was a college student, meeting a young woman who, and I was a Bible study leader, and if you knew me in college, you would not be surprised by who I was and the things I did, because I'm a rather consistent human being in many respects, not all. I remember I was a Bible study leader. I did a bunch of things that gave me a little bit of visibility on campus. But this young woman came to me and told me how her father basically took the words of Jesus seriously and left all to follow him, abandoning the family. Okay. Rick says the stream stopped and he doesn't know why. Okay. I'm going to keep talking. You just fix it, and you want me to stop? Oh, you're going to unplug the network. Oh, so I'm getting off Discord. All right. So we're going to pause here, and I got to come back and finish up the story about the college girl, which I told already. I know I told it already. I'm not going senile. So, all right. Rick's going to reboot our network here at the church, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Go for it, Rick. Okay.
Is it solar flares?
All right, we should be back, guys.
All right, we're back in the Discord.
Yeah.
So we're back streaming? All right. So, well, I'm hearing a lot of echo, Rick. I don't know if that's coming through you. So this young woman had a lot of hurt feelings about her father's application of the commands of Jesus and how that impacted her. And she had a point, because when we say Jesus' command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, I often emphasize your neighbor goes all the way up to and includes your enemies, but it also includes your children. And, Jesus has some pretty dramatic things to say about, hating your father and mother and let the dead bury their own dead. But Jesus also on the cross gives his mother to John for care. So all these things have to be taken into consideration. And so this is why we pray, trust the Spirit, ask for forgiveness. Sometimes the greatest forgiveness we have to ask is for the things we do in our zeal for the Lord. My father spent probably, most of my childhood racing around Patterson, helping everyone. And I don't know that I felt particularly abandoned by it, because you're a kid, you grow up and your father does what he does. But I think later in life, he had some regrets about his time management when his children were young. And I certainly have regrets about some of those kind of things too. It's hard to not live long and tally up some regrets and think, gosh, I could have done that better. And that's sort of life. So I think also part of what's difficult for us today is that I was watching Michael Shermer and Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying on the Michael Shermer show, and it didn't rise to the level of me wanting to do much commentary on it. I thought it was interesting though. And Heather was talking about screens and how they impact young people, and I thought those were very salient comments. But all of us have been deeply impacted by screens, and those screens have recalibrated our view of the world. There are many Christians who live holy, sacrificial lives. There are many more than we can imagine. And the reason that our calibration of that is way off is because we have our view of the world has been recalibrated by television and radio and print media and all of these things. And so I know this because I see it even in a tiny little church like mine. There are people in my church that if someone is hurting or has a need, money will show up. And the people who figure out how to do this are very good at covering their trails. Rod Hugan, when he was on my channel, I should have Rod on again. He's so much fun. Rod talked about the fact that Rod's father died when Rod was something like 14. And, this is back in the day when, his father had emphysema and all kinds of health issues. And so they moved from Iowa to Arizona. And Rod's mother had 4 kids, big kids, if you ever met Rod, 4 kids and, no money. And people in their church paid their Christian school tuition. They lived from the generosity of the other people in the church. These stories are not uncommon. And anyone who is maybe not so much in a mega church, but in small churches, anybody who's involved in small churches has lots and lots and lots of these stories. So I would say that the spirit of those texts lives on, but it takes on the flesh of locality as well it should. And saying this is not to take anything away from the deep respect that I have to the Anabaptist tradition and to someone like Julian, who is living it right now. I mean, why? I remember when I first met Julian. Here's a brilliant young man. Why aren't you going to college? Well, he's welding dumpsters, and he's reading Kierkegaard, and he's involved in Rando's conversation, and he's going to a college of a different sort. And he does so because of his Christian faith. And I forget where I was recently, but I was driving someplace, and there was a Hutterite farm. I think it might have been up in Minnesota or Montana. And part of me wanted to stop, but I didn't. And, the Christians continue to do this. It's just that it doesn't make the news. And I think that's probably a good thing. So, all right. Anybody have anything they want to say on that from the voice chat?
I kind of do. I was about to kind of mention something. I'm typing it up right now, but it's about your little comment right there where you mentioned the most gracious and generous people in a church tend to be the ones who can cover their tracks, and it seems like these gifts just appear.
Yep.
When I really clicked into Peterson and Pajot's communities was when that comment kind of kept ringing through with them. A hierarchy, when it's properly working, the top gives down to the most bottom, and the center is never forgotten. It's really powerful. I run a homeless initiative, and like most of our volunteers are elderly, and now that they are beginning to age out, I can't find a way to get the youth to do that. They all want to post it on TikTok and get 1 million followers for everything they do. So it's just heartbreaking.
Yep. I don't think we have any idea what all these screens have done to us. And you're talking to a guy who's, as you well know, is putting a ton of content up there on screens. You can just listen to it on podcast version too, even without the commercials. But that older generation that is passing away, they are going to be missed. And when that older generation passes away, you are going to see a slew of churches, like living stones, that are going to disappear from the land. And I'm telling you, they are going to be missed. And we'll see. We'll see what comes. So that's a great comment. Thank you. Albert, does the Bible have a unified message about physical and spiritual aspects of worship? I've been thinking a lot recently about how many of the people of God in the Old Testament worship and make offerings in high places after the tabernacle is established. Samuel, David, and Solomon all take part in the practice without explicit condemnation, and yet latter kings are condemned by their chroniclers for not removing the high places. You can listen to Christine Hayes's YouTube class on the Old Testament. That gets a lot of commentary, and rightfully so. It has me thinking about some sects of Christianity embrace overtly physical acts in worship, and others condemn the involvement of the physical as idolatrous. Has the removal of the high places in Jewish worship in any way analogous to iconoclasm? I think it's more analogous to what happened in the Council of Trent to the Roman Catholic Church, as I read in the book Reformations. There's a tension between centralization, which affords control, and distributed realities, which has abundant chaos. I think, if you've got all the high places, and I think the undertone of the, as Christians call the Old Testament, was that over time, the do-it-yourselfism of the high places basically had a deleterious effect on the nation and the spiritual quality of the people. That isn't to say that there aren't that centralization doesn't lead to corruption, because we see that too. You can see this right now in American evangelicalism and folk religions. One of the things that I haven't really figured out how to bring into my videos yet is a little bit more work on, I'm really thinking about the relationship between Mark Driscoll and WWE wrestling. These are folk religions that people participate in. And part of what happened after the Cold War, when participation in church, especially the main line, there are lots of layers to that, declined dramatically, is a lot of people basically went to having high places and backyard altars. And I don't mean that literally, although in some cases in Catholicism, people will have little altars in their home. So this tension runs throughout Christianity. It was never fully extinguished. And in fact, the tension in some ways gets expressed in the development of the synagogues. Because if you centralized and the central temple is destroyed, what will your people do? And so what happens is that Torah replaces the altar, and the scrolls are kept in an ark. And when I was growing up, the Christian Reformed Church had a little daily devotional that today is called Today. It used to be called, which blows my mind, the Daily Altar. And, there's some people that have said, well, the Christian Reformed Church is sort of the Jews of American Protestantism. And I understand some of the reasons they think so. Perhaps partly because in one way or another, perhaps so many who went over from northern Netherlands that made up the Christian Reformed Church, like myself, had Jewish ancestry. Probably Jews that escaped Spain, and the Netherlands were sort of the fringe of the span of the empire at that point. And so they went to the northern Netherlands and, sort of intermingled with the Frisians and did dairy work. And those are the people that came over to the United States. And so the family altar, it's the family altar. I mean, that's just blows my mind. But it has everything to do with the development of the synagogue and the development of observation of the Torah, of prayers, of readings, and that then gets translated into the New Testament church in terms of the Bible. But of course, once you have the printing press and Protestantism, now everybody can afford to have a Bible. You don't have to go to the church to have the priest read it to you, and you can read it for yourself. And so you have the rise of pietism. And in many ways, pietism is sort of analogous to worship at the high places. If you look, for example, at the end of the book of Judges, the book of Judges really takes this issue on. And at the end of the book of Judges, you basically have a redux of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah that revolves around a Levite who sort of goes rogue. So there's a lot going on with this, and it's sort of a chaos and order dynamic, and it's a center versus fringe dynamic, and so let's say in terms of Christian eschatology, if you look to the book of Revelation, well, there's no temple because everything's a temple, and there's no, is there an altar? Well, the saints are hiding under in the book of Revelation. So there's a lot going on with this. It's a great question, but it's a huge question. And so it's one of these questions that you should probably continue to ponder and to think about, and to think about it symbolically as you look around at, oh, Rick's back. Thank you for the super chat. Synapsion. And he asked a question. Good. So thank you, Rick. When Rick came over, I thought, oh no, we lost our feed again. Hopefully our feed is better and it isn't all buffered like it was before. Rick's a stickler to try and get this thing right. So it's a great question. And I think there is an analogy with the destruction of high places. Well, is it to iconoclasm? You see, iconoclasm is much more of an intensification and a purification. So one of the polarities is chaos and order. Another one is centralization versus fringe. And another polarity, but in different directions, are heaven and earth. And again, when we get to Luke's question a little bit later, we're always dealing with the tensions in that polarity. And iconoclasm is all about worshiping the form or the ideal, as opposed to attempting to create an instantiation. Again, Monday's video coming out, a commentary on the universal history with Richard Rowland. I'm going to get into some of that because, for example, Richard Rowland talks about the fact that if you go to Lincoln's tomb, there's a bronze and everybody touches the nose, which then Peugeot says, well, this is like going to the Vatican with this bronze of Peter and the feet are worn off because everybody is touching the feet. This is deeply human inside of us. The iconoclastic spirit looks at that and says, and this is deep in Protestantism, but it's not exclusively Protestant, because in many ways Protestantism is sort of an accentuation of many of the tensions that are within not only Christianity right from the start, but also within the Hebrew prophets and the writings of the Old Testament. All those tensions are there, and I think Barfield is one who sort of brings them out. But iconoclasm is where we're getting too close to idolatry. The statues, I mean, it's the story of the bronze serpent. The bronze serpent, which God commanded be raised. The bronze serpent is creating a cult that is devolving a relational devotion into a transactional idolatry. And so you're not going to get rid of the spirit of iconoclasm, because what it does is it's sort of a regulating spirit that keeps us from falling into transactional paganism. But when the spirit of iconoclasm goes too far, then you sort of get religion that is so heavenly minded it's of no earthly good. So there are all these tensions within these polarities, and they're not just in, this is very Peugeotian, they're not just in Christianity. You'll find them all over the place, because they're, as Peugeot better than anyone else continues to relate, they're in the fabric of creation. You're not going to get rid of them in this dispensation. Now, what Christ brings in the age to come, in the new heavens and the new earth, we don't know. But in this dispensation, as Peugeot says, reality lays itself out this way. So high places are destroyed, but that's centuries they're dealt with. They keep coming back. And in fact, you have Elephantine, I believe, you have a temple down there. What's up with that? You have temples, part of the reason why is Peugeot talking about Ethiopia? Well, there's a real reason. You have temples down there, they claim to have the Ark of the Covenant. So this stuff doesn't go away, and it never will go away, but it just takes up the form of the family altar. What is the family altar in the Christian Reformed Church? It's the family huddled around the reading of Scripture after they partook in a meal together. Is that deeply Christian? Yeah. Does it sound rather Jewish? Yeah. Is it sort of a Passover light ceremony? Yeah. These things just keep going. Is it sort of a reformation of high places? A reinstantiation of the fringe, more chaotic, yet closer to home? Yeah. That's all those things. So it's a really great question.
I have something to add on that, Paul. If that's all
go
right.
ahead.
So I was just thinking this morning, actually, about why the heck Jesus would go up onto a mountain to pray, right? And then once I thought about that, I made a flasher insight, because in the summer after my 7th grade year, I went to a Young Life camp in Oregon. And one of the things they had us do, and I was very surprised that they had us do this, was they took us on like a half-hour hike up a mountain that probably had like 1,000 feet of elevation climb. And it's surprising they would do that, because middle schoolers would probably complain that this is too long and all of this. But what they were doing, I would suspect, is that they're trying to play off of this theme of Christ going up to a mountain to pray to his Father, right? Now, Jesus doesn't have a physical, like a shrine or anything that he's doing this with. So it's not necessarily playing into icons, but there's still this this dynamic of a location which is changing how you relate to God, which is in some ways is very anti-Protestant, right? So should that play into how we think about how we relate to God?
Absolutely. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. I look to Jehovah for aid. This is a psalm that became a favorite. The Christian Reformed Church had a Psalter hymnal, because at first we felt very uncomfortable about singing anything other than what was found in the Bible. But the Yosemite National Park is a high place. Now, there's no altar there. There's a chapel there, but there's no altar there. But people come from around the world to walk into the valley and to be filled with awe. And this is sort of where we get into, sort of Jordan Peterson land too, because psychologically and evolutionary psychology, why are those dynamics still present? It's built into us. And Protestants, it's so funny, because the more you study this stuff, the more you realize all of the traditions. To be a human being is to not be consistent, and to manifest so many of these things so regularly. So yeah, there's Mount Hermon in the Bay Area near us, where there's a Bible conference center, and Jesus goes up to a mountain to give to give his new law, the Sermon on the Mount. The 10 Commandments, they're up in a mountain. I mean, it's these things we don't get rid of. And I think what a lot of the traditions do, like Protestantism, is they just try to, they sort of try to beat it down on one hand, and that beating helps it not get too out of hand. And you watch it get out of hand. In some ways, just paganism is just letting off all the restraints, and then people go and do what people go and do. So no, it's a great point. It's a great point. All right, John the Plunger. Hi, thanks for replying to my last question, even if you didn't have much to say. Hope you've had a little peek into Rubicon. I haven't this week. In Dostoevsky's The Possessed, the character Shastov sees the futility of the socialistic society and later pays for it with his life. in one of his last conversations with Nikolai, he says something interesting, and it reminds me of what you were saying in your 9/11 video and in general about spirits. He talks about nations that are bound together by their gods. These gods, he simplifies to be the nation's common ideas of what good and evil is. Watch Peugeot's latest Universal History video. They get deep into that. And again, I'll be treating that on Monday. He explains that if the nation loses the belief in its God, it ceases to be a nation. That's pretty much what Peugeot and Roland say, and they're right. These gods or spirits are what hold a people together. Again, you're summarizing Peugeot's video. Shatov sees socialism as inevitably leading to atheism, since they emphasize communality between nations and bring in a foreign god that competes with theirs. The people is destroyed, and so is their belief in God. Atheism is the result. What do you think of this? The deeper I get into this, the more skeptical I am that atheism exists. And people want to debate whether or not God exists, and I made a trollish comment on Twitter this morning about that. I saw Matt Dillahunty is doing yet another debate with some Christian about whether God exists, and it feels like TV and syndication. Because what I'm skeptical exists are atheists. Now, this gets into the question of how we define God. And I think that's the trick beneath all of these God or no God conversations, because the atheists have lots of gods. They just don't define them as gods, and they don't see them as gods. So, but they got lots of gods. And Peugeot and Roland are right that the gods of America are in some ways Lincoln and Washington, and the hagiographies that surround them are what create the American spirit. That's how human beings work. We don't get around it. And the problem that atheists have is they're sort of a hyper version of Protestantism, and they're the most ruthless iconoclasts. You know, not only are they destroying statuary, they're trying to ban words. And they think that if they ban words like God or miracle or prayer, they think if they can ban those things, then they can get rid of, it's analogous to getting rid of statuary in churches. Now, I personally am raised Protestant, so I don't really like statuary in churches. But anybody who watches my sermons know I use a lot of imagery. So atheists, I'm very skeptical that atheists exist. And that's part of what was cool about Peterson, because he basically went out and told atheists that they weren't atheists. And they, of course, were upset by that. And then they proceeded to understand almost nothing of what he said. And if you want to see that, just watch his conversations with Sam Harris. And recently in a video, he said, I don't think Sam Harris understood. And I think that's exactly right. And if you look at my commentary on my commentary on Peterson's conversations with Sam Harris, that's exactly right. Peterson and Sam Harris talking are like 2 3-year-olds. I don't mean the 3-year-old thing is a bit disparaging, but this is an analogy that we all can understand. One 3-year-old is looking across the way and saying, here we have some blocks. Let's play together and build something together. And so Jordan keeps trying to build something with the blocks, and Sam keeps kicking it over. That's what happened in those conversations. And it's because Sam is a radical iconoclast. And so he's not tearing down statues, he's tearing down words. But Peterson's point is, you can tear down those words all you want. You can tear down the statues all you want. The underlying forces don't go away, and you will just wind up playing out these things in different ways. Hence, you have Richard Rowland going to his iconoclastic Reformed Baptist seminary and seeing icons of dead and departed church leaders. And I talk about that in that video. So that's exactly right. These things don't go away. communism is basically, again, extreme iconoclasm. But what you see the communists doing, just like the Nazis do, is if you're going to have a system that works, you're going to have to instantiate your ideals and the spirits in rituals and architecture and song and practice and all of these things. This stuff is, human beings don't achieve community without these things, and they will take some form. And part of the reason, Peugeot, the rise of Peugeot and the timing, and same with Peterson, has everything to do with timing. And Peugeot, I think, is in some ways more conscious of this than Peterson, is modernity is losing its grip. And now we are able to see what has been there all along. We just didn't have eyes to see. And so when, in the wake of George Floyd, people are in the streets doing things that would have horrified atheists, this is just what we do. But back to Peterson, there are better and worse. There are more effective and less effective with these inevitably recurring manifestations of the structure of humanity. And what underlies Peterson's argument is that if you want to look at really successful systems, you're probably going to want to focus on religious systems. Now, religious systems are always in conflicts. The spirits are warring. There's a war in the heavenlies, but Christ has overcome. So, modernity, and this is where, modernity had to rise. And we've been blessed by its rising and cursed by its rising. Now, the spirit of modernity is waning. Other spirits are now manifesting and taking hold. And some of those spirits are very old. And we're watching it happen. But, again, to have someone who's deeply rooted in modernity like myself talking this spiritual talk, a lot of people just think it's crazy and word salad. But no. Communism and Nazism, they're intensifications of certain spirits that, and this is where I think Adam Friended is right, could not be, these things were not stable, and they could not be stable. And so they blew out. Now, it's quite obvious that as a nation, we sort of have earmarked Nazism as the great Satan. We don't use those words because we're secular, but we play it out that way. Yet fascisms manifest themselves on the right and the left. Communism, quite dramatically, as Peterson often notes, should be labeled. They killed far more people than the Nazis. Yet we haven't figured that out yet, apparently. There was a rise of it in the 30s, the 20s and 30s. That was supposed to be the new wave. There's a rise of it in the 60s. And what tends to happen, it seems, with that spirit is we go down a certain road and we get down far enough and it's like, oh yeah. It's kind of like if you have a bad habit. My wife and I always joke, stay up too late at night, you watch junk TV and you eat junk food. So let's say you're watching junk TV and, I'm feeling a little hungry. So you pull out that snack and maybe you eat a big plate of nachos and you get to the end of the plate of nachos and it's like, well, maybe that wasn't a good idea. That seems to be what we do with communism, and that, oh, this looks so good. And I think Tom Holland is right that there's some Christian resonance underneath the earlier question about the Pentecost honeymoon texts. But we get into it and it's like, and this, I want to develop this more in some of my upcoming videos, we trigger these purity cultures. And this morning I was thinking about the fact that I watch people just, usually deconstructed Christians just go all crazy about Christian purity culture. Oh, Christian purity culture. Oh, Christian purity culture. And the rise and fall of Mars Hill touches on that too. And they can't see that the peer pressure of getting Governor Cuomo out of office is a purity culture. It's a sexual purity culture. And in some ways, it's deeply Christian. You know, Governor Cuomo didn't go on Time magazine like Jimmy Carter and confess he had lust in his heart. He got railroaded out of office because he couldn't just keep it in his heart. And this is, you know, Governor Cuomo was not Ravi Zacharias. I mean, I'm not in any way saying, you know, that to whatever degree he inappropriately touched anybody in his office, he shouldn't be held accountable to that. I'm not saying that. But the Puritan spirit of the woke left, you know, someone on CRC Voices made the comment about, he said, you know, so many of these woke are, you know, in the 1920s, the Christian Reformed Church was very against worldly amusements. Don't go to movies. Well, this purity culture of the woke is just, it's just a remanifestation of, somebody mentioned to me recently, the temperance movement, the holiness movement. You know, the holiness movement grabbed American Christianity in the 19th century, grabbed it hard. And we've got a holiness movement now. It's just a bunch of the rules are changed, but it's a holiness purity movement. But we can't see our own possessions often. Other people can see them. So I watch these things and I just snicker. But these purity movements, they burn themselves out because you just become obsessive compulsive about things. And the fact that, you know, who had been, except for the nursing home COVID things, I mean, Cuomo was a hero of the left. I mean, people wanted him to run for president or to be a vice presidential possibility. And he's out of office. You know, Al Franken, same thing. So, you know, to watch deconstructed Christians on Twitter just going crazy about purity cultures, I just laugh. It's just hilarious. So maybe that's the troll in me. But the socialists are the same thing, same way. And when the Black Lives Matter executive bought that very wealthy, ritzy place overlooking Los Angeles, and Benjamin Boyce on Twitter called it Black Lives Manor. I mean, the poverty of these contemporary religious movements is that they're so poorly formed that the zealots of their movement can't really be taken seriously. And again, this gets back to, on a very regular basis, deeply committed North American Christians turn down lucrative jobs and comfortable lifestyles to serve the poor in Africa in missionary hospitals. That is the manifestation of the Holy Spirit. If in this attention economy, you can become wealthy via some moralistic crusade against, pick your often very legitimate evils in the world, but you can't say no to your own appetites. And we all struggle with our own appetites. So it just, to me, shows the poverty of these new religions. And yeah, the same thing. It's the same thing brought down the Soviet Union. And that's the difference, I think, Peterson is right that ideologies, the way he's using the word when he says it that way, there's lots of different ways to use that word ideology, and it gets confusing, but they're crippled religions. And you see that by the saints of the religion. And that's where, again, Peugeot and Roland were right. The saints create the world. Chad the alcoholic. I had a thought yesterday. It was initially a joke. But what do you want to think? What do you think about this? Trophies were won by merit and competence, right? Then eventually there was the arrival of participation trophies, right? The next progression would be proposition trophies. What would proposition trophies look like? They might look like the vagina trophy that Nadia Bolz-Weber gave to Gloria Steinem. Stein? I can't remember. Yeah, I don't know. Well, we'll look forward to seeing what you do with it, Chad, on your video channel. Anthony, I don't know how to say your last name. Thoughts on Junipero Serra and the recent controversy surrounding him? I haven't answered this. I don't know a lot about Serra. I believe, just off the top of my head, that Serra was one of the Roman Catholic founders of the California missions. If you go to public school in California, 4th grade is California history, and in the past you would go to the missions. And if you just want to look at the war in the heavens and the passing of spirits through our ages, just follow the reputation of the California missions. Now, of course, the Russians and the Great Russian Empire were, in Alaska and coming down the coast. And the Spanish were, of course, in Latin America coming up the coast. And one way to secure California was, and its colonization was, the missions. And these missions, they're an astoundingly interesting history. And you can, like many complex things, you can pitch them all sorts of different ways. And when we judge them, we're certainly saying as much about our filters as the beliefs that were acted out in the missions. So I am by no means an expert on Roman Catholic missions. Of course, there's the very famous movie, The Mission, with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Iron, which is a very moving movie about the missions in South America. But visit the missions in California and just, Tom Holland suggests that what happened in the 1960s and has continued on since then was a watershed moment on the scale of the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century. He could be right. We're not in a position to tell because we're way too close to it. But maybe the European discovery of the Americas is analogous to putting a man on the moon. I don't think those are the aspects that he's talking about, but we're deeply mysterious creatures. So I don't know enough about Serra to really comment on it. But if anybody's interested in it, the continual revisionism over the historiography of the missions is fascinating to watch. Alt Ronan. Hi, Paul. I contend that most of the talk I hear about postmodernism totally misses the point, as if the central issue was the content of the ideas related to it rather than the mode of analysis itself. Well, you're right in that postmodernity is a shift in mode. I think you're correct about that. Which I believe an ultra-conservative can act out just as easily as a communist, and I think that's exactly right. And when I talk about the fact that someone appropriating Orthodox Christianity today is in some ways just as postmodern as, who do you want to pick on? Derrida. I mean, just look at Peugeot's story. I mean, again, as is my practice, the first time I talked to Jonathan, being the nosy guy that I am, I wheedled his story out of him. I mean, Peugeot comes to where he's at right now, honestly. His parents left the Roman Catholic Church, and I just touched on that whole, I read the sample of that book about the secularization of Quebec. Oh, that's a fascinating story. I don't have time to read all the interesting books. I'm way too ADHD. And just before the show, Mark was chastising me for my ADHD-ness. I gotta get down to business and do some short videos and put things down straight. And then Peugeot goes to art school. And so, I mean, if there's any aspect of our culture that's postmodern, it was there in the arts. The artists are always at the front lines. Peterson's right about that. And he goes to Africa as a missionary, back to, ancient craft, let's say. And then he and his brothers go down this rabbit hole of symbolism. And now at the fullness of time, when Jordan Peterson sort of breaks open the conversation, Peugeot walks through. There we are. It's an astounding thing. Even if we get this, we might say things like the fundamental problem is an insistence on seeing the world primarily through the lens of groups. I increasingly feel, though, that previous to this is the sociological or any kind of zoomed out point of view at all. I think you're exactly right. I think you're exactly right here. Aren't we ultimately doomed by our own analysis until we spend more time talking and thinking about ourselves and specific people than about society? Yes. And so this tension that you're talking about is all over the next question. And in some ways, what so many of us are trying to figure out. And we're sort of still with Plato and Aristotle in this. And, the Vervaeke stuff, what do they say about philosophy? Everything's just footnotes on Plato. We're kind of still there because you're right here. And this is a terrific observation. Specific individuals, not the individual, no matter how benevolent our intentions. No, that's right. And in some ways, this has been present in Christianity. You can find it at the end of the Gospel of John when, Jesus is sort of restoring Peter and it's kind of uncomfortable. And he looks over at John. So now you got the bookends of the disciple, Peter the eldest, John the youngest. But there's, symbolically something important about firsts and lasts. So Peter points to John and says, well, what about him? And Jesus is like, why are you worried about him? And so you've got the individual and the group. There's another polarity that's not going to go away. Solzhenitsyn says at the beginning of his book, or not at the beginning of his book, but says, every individual is the center of the world. That's true. And any individual that acts like the center of the world can't be tolerated, and so we kill them. And so when Jesus talks that way, we kill him because none of us are actually the center of our world. We're the center of my world. So I think your comments here about postmodernity are dead on right. And postmodernity has always been with us to some degree. It's just been implicit in all of these tensions that have always been with us. And they're not going to go away with this iteration of reality. Luke, I got to take a drink. Anybody have something they want to say? Guess not. Luke, stemming from a convo with Dave W. and Nate Heil and me, what is more real, the cupness of the cup or the cup? Well, there's the same question we've been talking about the whole time. How does this, and in some ways, asking me to choose, you might think about that. And in some ways, we always have to choose. But the choice is the answer more than the words I'm saying. And in that way, actions, I mean, I said a number of times, Christianity is not a list, and I know you love this, Luke, because you're Luke. Christianity is not a list of propositions. That doesn't mean that the propositions are incidental. The propositions describe things, and we need those descriptions to live in community with each other. But nowhere in the New Testament are we judged by what we think. That's a little far. We are sort of. But the ultimate judgment is always based on what we do. Why? Because doing is finally the instantiation of the ideal, or the attempt at instantiating an ideal. Again, Monday's video are going to deal with this a lot, because this whole, basically, Richard Rowland makes the observation that, so what we do when we act is we manifest, we instantiate, we exhibit, we make real an ideal, or at least an attempt at making real the ideal. But then why is hagiography so popular? Why do people sit and watch, or did people, at least for a time, sit and watch Worldwide Wrestling, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation? Because what we do actually is things come down, instantiate, and then in order for us to actually participate, appropriate, see, and understand, we take them back up again to a degree. And then we keep, it's actually a loop that we keep doing. And this loop stitches heaven and earth together. And that's what life is. It's a stitching together of heaven and earth. That's what humanity is, in a way that the animals are not. This is why we are image bearers of God. We stitch together heaven and earth in human community, in our own individual lives. And that is what living is. And again, I'll talk about that more in my Monday video. What is more real, the cupness? How does this relate to the incarnation? Because this is exactly what Christ is, and who Jesus was, and who Jesus is. And that's why Jesus is God. This stuff gets esoteric when you talk about it. But the talking about it is nowhere near as powerful as the living it. But we only can be moved by the spirit of living it when we are told about it. You see how it's like sewing. You're just going around and around and around and around, and you're connecting heaven and earth together. By the way, Nate and I are going to have a convo on personalism. Oh, good. And I think, thanks, Dave W., that my above question relates to personalism and Platonism. I think that's true. And cordially, probably not a word, but a deal, nominalism. Oh, boy, I'm going to put nominalism aside right now, because that's opening up a whole nother thing. Because nominalism is about our appropriation of the real. And nominalism is a deep skepticism about our ability to do that. So this binding, I don't think we do it any other way. So I know that sounds astoundingly esoteric, and I apologize for that, but there it is. Althaus, Paul, in a recent video, you asked why the culture is not celebrating the religious conservatives for being rebels. My point is that they are, at least internet culture. Ooh, I love this point. This is a great point, which is kind of a young vanguard culture. You're right. We reached a point where being outside the Overton window was a badge of honor. That's right. And that's, again, this is so Peugeoting center and fringe. Take, for example, the word based. By declaring something to be based, you can give your approval for outrageous things that you would never dare to hold or defend. If I were a left-winger, I would call this meme a normalization of fascism. Luckily, I'm not a left-winger, so I'll only say the based meme is itself based. That's a great point. That's a great point, and you're right. And that is... feedback loops are a constant thing, but they haven't, in nuclear bombs, we call them chain reactions, but they haven't destroyed us yet. Why? Because of the kind of dynamics that you're pointing to. And you're right. You're right. It's a great point. Pick. I better close the questions. No more questions for today. Next Q&A will be, let's see, October 1. Okay. Pick. To what extent is it good to fight against deconstruction? Peugeot talks about deconstruction as synonymous with death, and I tend to agree. But on the flip side, deconstruction has opened culture up to more symbolic ways of thinking. That's right. I tend to think of restoration of Christianity and the righteous governance as possible but unlikely. I'm a man of faith. I think it's inevitable. Part of that is an intuition that many basic things have to fall apart before they can be rebuilt. I think that's true. But things get pretty perilous when basic assumptions are being retooled and it isn't obvious what will lead to an accelerated deconstruction or a restoration. Hope this makes sense, and thanks. No, that makes an abundance of sense. And so if you look at, eschatology is the area of theology that is the least agreed upon. Now, obviously, in our little corner of the internet, we have some Unitarians, some Jews who are Unitarians. We have Unitarian Sam. Sam always gets a shout out in every video, it seems, or at least every Q&A. So we're lucky to have him. Otherwise, we'd have to make up another name or wouldn't be aware of this. But eschatology and the three main options on the menu in terms of Christian eschatology are postmillennialism, which basically says things just keep getting better. Premillennialism, there's a lot of different versions of it, which basically says things are going to get worse and worse and worse. And amillennials that basically say, we don't know. Historically, I don't know about the Orthodox, but Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists tend to be amillennial. At the end of the 19th century, postmillennialism sort of had its heyday, and in response to it, premillennialism sort of reacted against it. When you look at the woke, for example, a video I want to do next week, again, Mark wants me to do small videos, but I want to do a big video on this conversation that was on Sean McDowell's channel on whether or not progressive Christianity and conservative Christianity are the same religion. Ooh, that's a juicy thing. And so I want to bring in Charles Taylor, and some Andrew Root, because that author, I have to pick up that author's book. That author is right. They're not the same thing, and they're going like this. And this has been happening, at least in the United States, since the Civil War for some important reasons. But when you look at the woke, are they post-millennial? Are things going to get better and better? Part of them wants to be. Or are they premillennial, catastrophists? Part of them are that way too, because, we're cooking the world and we have to stop it, which I'm not skeptical about climate change. I can't imagine we dump this much chemistry into the planet. It's not going to impact things. How? I don't know. I'm not a climate scientist. But it's a very poorly formed religion. And it's what happens with poorly formed religions is that they sort of blow up and then they go away. And so one of the ways, a metaphor to understand religions through time is like volcanism. Pressures mount, they spew a bunch of lava, and once they've released the pressures, they sort of go away and they leave rocks and mountains and minerals out on the land, and over very long periods of time that changes the land and successive volcanisms. So, of course, Peugeot very much sees Christianity as cyclical. Now Peugeot, see, I don't know. I've heard that, Peugeot went to Africa with the Mennonite Central Committee, which is very interesting. But you never know how much of that is doctrinal and how much of that is just incidental. So, Peugeot can sometimes get a little bit be somewhat of a catastrophist in terms of his predictions and premonitions about the future. That's interesting. But now you've got the big arc, which is sort of the world picture, and you've got the individual arcs, which are the people who are deconstructing. And so I'm less anxious about deconstructing people, because so many of them reconstruct, because you just can't live without these structures. And on that, Peugeot is right. There are consequences to decisions and ideas and thoughts and the ways communities form. You're just not going to get around these things. And so, of course, Chesterton very famously has this wonderful chapter on, the 7 deaths of Christianity. Christianity keeps dying and keeps rising again. Well, what would you expect from a religion that is all about the resurrection of Jesus Christ? How the details are, we're far too close to know. What the future holds, none of us know. But again, my take is that finally Christianity is an astoundingly optimistic faith, that God remains in the heavens. He remains in charge, and he loves his people. And even in the midst of horrendous suffering and loss, will see us through. And we will reign with him over a new heavens and a new earth. Now, what he does with that, I have no idea. But at the heart of Christianity is that God can be trusted. Now, certainly not trusted to give you a life that is free of pain, because his own son dies a brutal death on the cross. And just look at the history of Israel. The old, we're your chosen people. Maybe choose somebody else, because To be used by God is a hard calling. And the Bible is not in any way, Old or New Testament, conflicted about that. So, yeah, death and rebirth. What else would Christianity be about? Death and resurrection, new life. Tales of the intellectual dark web. Oh my. Hey, Paul, I don't know if this is the best forum to ask this, but I wanted to know if you got to catch Sitch and Adams' show this last Sunday. No, I didn't. You think I make long videos? Those guys, they're fun though. I like listening to them. I just don't often have the time. And, you know, Mark's right. I ramble way too much. And if I would only settle down and get organized, but I part of me, I have to do that. I have to commit to writing if I'm going to do that, because that's where I can actually focus thought. And I did a lot more writing before I did YouTube. And that's why I always say my videos are just, these are my notes. These are my rough drafts. I'm thinking out loud. So what they talk about? They had a conversation about morality in general. Adam loves to talk about that. And makes a moral system and what makes a moral system successful. He and I have spoken about that. And how to look at morality objectively. That's a word that's not going to give you what you want it to give you. Stemming from a shoe on head tweet condemning bestiality. I'm going to have to find it. I think 1 or 2 out of the 5 people were any kind of theists in the conversation. It got a little heated and stymied, but I thought you'd have interesting thoughts if you'd watched it or planning on it. Timestamps are pinned in the comments. It just gets the most interesting when Sargon joins the call. That does sound interesting. I'm going to look it up if I get the time. I've got too many projects on my mind. You know, Mark, really, I think I'm just waiting for retirement. And unfortunately, that's 10 years from now, and most of you guys will probably be done with me by then, but I won't be done with me by retirement, hopefully. Hopefully the Lord's not done with me by retirement. So, yeah, my videos now are just the notes and the thoughts. And if you can harvest from them, and I had lunch this week with someone who listens to my channel who's on Twitter quite active. I go back and forth with him on Twitter quite a bit. He's getting an advanced philosophy degree in the Bay Area. And so we finally got a chance to meet for lunch, and it was a great conversation. But it's like, I'm giving him ideas and he's using them. And he asked me where I get some of these ideas from. It's like, I don't know. I get them because I talk out loud on the internet. And the reason I do it is because when I say things, I record them. And if I say them 2 or 3 times, I remember them. And if I say something helpful, you ask me a question about it or remind me of it. And my whole channel is just a way to colonize all of you to help me think better. Now, hopefully it's helping you think better too, but that's what my channel is about. So here we have it. I'll have to see what's going on with Adam and Sitch. They're fun. I like those guys. Any thoughts on the passing and legacy of John Shelby Spong? I bought one of his books once because the title, Rick's wants me to do better titles. Because of the title, and I read the book and I thought, this is pointless. There are people out there that just simply manifest the desire of the zeitgeist. Such people will never be remembered except for that. I don't know much else about John Shelby Spong than what I read in in that book of his. The title of the book, I believe, was Christianity Must Change or Die. Maybe I should write a book, Christianity Will Die and Rise Again. So says G.K. Chesterton and Jonathan Peugeot. But the idea of Spong was just basically Christianity has to do exactly what the blue church says it should. And what we've seemed to have seen is that that's actually the recipe of death for a church, because churches thrive being countercultural. And, Althaus's point there is exactly right. And so, yeah, follow the culture. The culture will celebrate you and say, thanks for the follow, and keep going among their merry business. And unfortunately, a lot in the main line are right there. And unfortunately, there are many committed Christians that remain in the main line, and they're suffering. So, all right. My apologies for all my bothersome questions. That's all right, Chad. No big deal. Thank you so much for your time. With all the seemingly contradictory statements and stories in the Bible, it seems like this stuff was never meant to be truly figured out. It's okay not to have this stuff. Is it okay not to have this stuff pinned down? How can you? How could we? So, part of what we learned from the Bible are a lot of ideals. You can think about it in this way. You'll never fully instantiate an ideal, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be pursued. The easiest doctrine of the Reformed faith to believe is total depravity. Not that everyone is as bad as they could be. No, that is, total depravity has to be merged with common grace. They have to be held together. And common grace is in the structure of the world in many ways. So, but what total depravity says is we never get it all the way right, not in this age. And so the Bible is exactly how God desired it to be. And it's doing its work among us. And, what's so funny about the Bible is it's just so doggone difficult to get rid of, even with everybody doing it wrong. But it just doesn't go away. I mean, that's what Peterson recognized about it. I mean, I loved how he began his first biblical series. Why on earth am I talking here about the Bible, and why are all of you here? And that's the Jordan Peterson moment. There it is. That's the question. What on earth is happening here? And the most fun question about Jordan Peterson is exactly that question. What in the world is going on? Why would a Canadian psychologist attract 500 or 600 people into the Bader Theater at $40 a pop to listen to him ramble for 2 hours about the Bible, when a week or two later they could watch it for free on the internet? Why does anybody go to church? Why do people open up that book, use it for devotions? Why does that book continue to change the world? We can't answer that question. People want, we should get rid of it. The more you try to get rid of it, the more it seems to come back. There's something right about it. It's not going away. These new religious movements have no conception of the failures. This is from Schuyler, scholar of nihilism. These new religious movements have no conception of the failures from humanity's past. I am scared of the libertarian movements. Like from my church, the Methodist Church now has the Liberation Methodist Connection movement. As you know, liberation theology tends to have one earthly outcome. Like I said, religious movements are sort of like volcanoes. They might shake the ground. They might fill the sky with dust so you can't see the sun. They might destroy a village. They might cause the crops to fail, but they pass. Jesus says heaven and earth will not pass away. Or the basically what he says of the scriptures, they'll not pass away until they're fulfilled. That's a crazy thing to say. People say, "Oh, I think Jesus is really cool." Did you ever read him? So Methodism is a very interesting story because, again, it was one of these reform movements that just transformed the landscape. Powerful, powerful movement. Liberation theology has at its heart some really good motivations. Does God love the poor? Yes. Does God pay special attention to the poor when they are abused by the rich? Yes. Are you God? No. There's the problem. Every time we slip into God's chair, we demonstrate to the world that we are not God and we cannot save. Salvation is from the Lord. Book of Jonah. It's a thesis statement of the Bible. Richard. Ooh, we're right on track. Depends how long this is. It came about in Dr. Leibold's Bible class. Clay Leibold was on my channel, and Richard, he taught Bible class for Richard for a while. Richard and his mom and his dad came down on his college tour. It was a delight to have lunch with them all on a Sunday afternoon. What a delight. It came about in Dr. Leibold's Bible class that a student asked the following question: is being gay a sin? Of course, this was an awkward question. Class full of teenagers in Christian high school. The obvious layer of that awkwardness is Dr. Leibold's actual position, which is very counter Linden. That's right. Clay Leibold didn't want to get run out of Linden, Washington on a rail. But I think there's another layer having to do with the dynamic you discussed in your most recent Randos conversation, the guy from Milwaukee. That is a certain taboo about speaking about homosexuality in liberal arts. But I also feel that taboo is creeping into conservative areas. Oh, absolutely. Sometimes we don't talk about what we know. We don't talk about well. And sometimes when I listen to a bunch of preachers that really love to talk about this, it sort of confirms in me I should keep my mouth shut. And as I said on Twitter, usually on Twitter, I give a little synopsis of my videos that I post in a day. I hate talking about this because I don't want to, because so Monday, I'm going to have a conversation with a guy in the CRC who is married. He and his husband are gay, and because the Human Sexuality Report in the CRC has 0 examples in there, 30 some examples in that report, has 0 example of a same-sex committed relationship. So, all right. I'm a light touch. Come on my channel. We'll talk. Part of why I don't like talking about this stuff is I really don't like conflict. And I've got lots of friends on both sides of this issue who simply can't stand the other side. And not only can't they stand it, which sort of, but this question brings them so much pain. So when I talk about this, I know people will be in pain. I don't want to bring pain into their lives. I don't want to bring pain into the lives of my friends who are same-sex attractive and have pursued romantic or sexual or marital relations with others. I don't want to bring pain into their lives by my words. Others of my friends are deeply conservative and traditional and believe that this is a crime against heaven and earth. And so when I don't say to either side what they want to hear, I cause pain in both sides, and I don't want to cause them pain. I don't like it. So I avoid. And lots of preachers are too. So even Clay Leibold, who's not made his position a secret, he's a retired CRC minister. And one of the things in the Christian Reformed Church, once you're retired, you can sleep with the organist or the organist's brother and they can't take away your pension. So unlike an active duty Christian Reformed minister, that sexual misconduct is the fastest way to get shuffled out of your day job. So, but I don't like talking about this because I don't like causing people I love pain. And I have people in my life now and in my past who they know I talk publicly. They know I talk a lot. And whatever I say on this subject is going to cause a lot of people pain. And I don't like it. But talk we must, because talking is better than the alternative. And that's why even on CRC Voices, where I do a lot of writing about this recently, both sides are to the conservative side is the time for talking is done. The time for action is here. Either we discipline or we leave. And if we don't have enough votes to discipline, we're leaving. And being a Protestant, I've seen enough leaving in my life, and that's pain too. And so I look down this road and I see nothing but pain, and I hate it. Part of being a Christian is learning how to pick up your cross and carry it. And so by virtue of where I am right now and the times that I've been given and the degree of leadership which I have to exert in the Christian Reformed Church, just by virtue of being a part of it, I feel an obligation to try to exert leadership in the ways that I can. So I talk about it, but I sure don't like it because I don't like causing pain to people I love. Anyway, that's what's behind some of this. The obvious layer is the awkwardness of Dr. Leibold's actual position, which is very counter-Linden. But I think there's another layer having to do with the dynamic you discussed in your most recent Randos conversation with the guy from Milwaukee. That is a certain taboo surrounding speaking about homosexuality in liberal areas. How you speak about it, absolutely. But I also feel that taboo is creeping into conservative areas, absolutely. So Tim Keller and Kevin DeYoung did a video, which I linked to in one of my videos, where they talked about the PCA, which is a more conservative church than the Christian Reformed Church. And Tim Keller started out talking about two sets of fears. And as is so often the case, Tim Keller can put his finger on things that many of us are sort of groping at. Sorry, Governor of New York. Tim Keller does that well. And the reason conservatives or moderates don't want to talk about this is because, well, some pastors don't want to talk about this because I know pastors that if they, so this afternoon, I'm going to, after I'm done with this and I chit chat with Rick, and if we do tacos or not do tacos, and I shuffle Rick out of here, I have to do my rough draft for Sunday. And I'm using this as my illustration for my sermon. And I'm really conflicted as to whether or not I want to do it because it opens up cans of worms in the church. Because in this church, I know people whose again, many of the people in this church are a little bit older than I am. I know people in this church who have siblings, had gay siblings who died of AIDS in the 80s and 90s. And I don't want to open up these cans of worms, but we have to talk about them. And I know that the easiest way to talk about them is to land fully on one side or the other. And if that's who you are, that's who you are. I don't want you to lie. To land fully on one side or the other, because you can find that group that will cheer your bold statement of truth against the horrendous other side. And so because of that, nuance is gone and truth-telling is gone. And corruption bleeds into the conversations. And both sides wind up with dirty little secrets that they don't dare admit to because they're letting down the cause. Both sides put themselves on slippery slopes of corruption. And so I basically make the decision, better to have the pain of telling the truth as I see it, and maybe disappointing, angering, and causing pain on both sides, than contributing to some slide, which inevitable victory in whatever subcultures or arenas both sides play in, that will basically undo the little purification schemes they've got going. Let's speak the truth. And Peterson is right in that. Lying makes you weak. And sometimes this goes a long ways. Now, all Dr. Leibold gave was the standard CRC answer of having homosexual desire is not sinful, but acting on them is sinful. That is the standard position of the Christian Reformed Church. But for some reason, this was not well understood. Of course not. That was an answer given in 1970s. The world has changed. And I talked about that in my little 45-minute video about this, because the dynamics between merciful accommodation and the demand for justice and equality and the purification spiral that often initiates, there's a world of difference in there. This was not well understood by these youthful creatures who have grown up in the world long past 1973, because some of the students quickly raised their hand to object. So you're saying it's okay to be gay. You're going to get this on both sides. Now, it is hard to believe that this slight distinction cannot be easily understood, but in my next class, the teacher, who had a daughter who was one of the quick objectors to Leibold, asked me, did Dr. Leibold really condone homosexuality? This is sloppy language, and in this way, language can be used to hurt one another, especially in small, tight-knit communities. Now, I recently discovered Tammy Faye Mesner, and I found interesting the ways her opponents articulated their critiques. Why is she not condemning gays? Let's just look at that sentence, condemning gays. What does that mean? Does that mean putting them up on crosses? Does that mean some kind of chemical injection? Does that mean putting a scarlet G on their clothes so they can't get employment or stay in hotels or? We've had a really complicated history with this subject. This subject is not going to get any less complicated in the way that we're pursuing it. And I wish people would read more history, because the subject itself has a long history and it's very complex. Sexuality is so difficult because my dog's sexuality, my cat's sexuality, cow sexuality, they're all very simple. Because unlike us, they are not the binding of heaven and earth. And I was just telling Rick this morning, I have 10 ideas for videos, and only for every amount of time I have to do one. And so maybe my answer is making shorter videos, but I can't do that, Mark, because my ideas are not fully formed. One of the ideas is that people today have an insufficient appreciation for the power of human reproduction. If you were to walk around saying to people, I'll give you $1 million, people will do a lot of things for that $1 million. Just watch reality TV. Having a baby is a costly thing, but it's way more powerful than $1 million. And we don't appreciate it. Ancients appreciated it. They understood it. The most horrible thing you could do to someone. This is the existential crisis suffered by Abraham and Sarah, is to be the end of the line. Why? Because it's eschatology. And we have a whole generation of people that are like, nah, kids are a pain. Yeah, you wait until these people are in their 50s and 60s and 70s. My wife and I started having kids in our 20s. We had 5. Has to be one of the most meaningful, difficult, enjoyable things of my entire life are my children. It's astounding. Human sexuality, super powerful. Keyword, condemning them. Exactly. Now, if this is the attitude that Christians have, then does the homosexual community not have a right to be angry about these ignorant Christians who have no idea about their experience? Keyword, right. Getting angry is not about having rights to get angry. People just get angry. Now, at some point, you're going to have to ask yourself, what is my anger getting me? So, yeah, I can understand very much the anger. Absolutely. And the sloppiness. And see, part of what hardline positions afford us is clarity. And clarity and purity are very connected. So, no, I can understand getting angry. Get angry. There's a lot to get angry about. What has your anger bought you? Some stomach acids, perhaps? Lost relationships? After I was watching one of the 9/11 documentaries, and there's one particular congresswoman who, hey, when those planes came, the country was angry, and it was looking to bomb somebody back into the Stone Ages. Leadership says, all right, I'm sure we'll do some bombing. We might do some invading, but let's not just go off reacting to things. That's wisdom. Anger is a part of life. Anger is a very bad master. And when I know people who their anger is their master, it's not a happy thing. Now, I have had experiences that indicate a lot of movement in conservatives' thoughts towards compassion. The biggest is confiding in a close friend that I struggled with having sexual desires towards him, and he's still a friend today. His understanding helped me tremendously. For me, part of the reason my position is so moderate, too moderate for the tastes of many people, is exactly this. C.S. Lewis's first friend, his name escapes me right now, was gay. It's same-sex attraction. And Lewis writes about that in A Severe Mercy when he's talking to Van Auken. I think part of what we're seeing now is, I think, what some of us have known a long time, which is that, especially among the youth, sexual orientation is on a spectrum. It is not that we've got 97% of people who are only ever attracted to the opposite sex and 3% who are attracted to the same sex. And all of those systems are locked. That's not at all the case. If that were the case, human history and human behavior would be very different. So I appreciate your friend. Your friend showed a great degree of maturity. Thank you. Oh, it's not having children. Oh, glad you got your question in here. I'll make sure I get it in. That'll be the last question of the day. If I can shut up about this. I say I don't like to talk about it, then I talk about it. It tells you how conflicted. So I appreciate your friend. Your friend is a very mature person. I had a friend in college who, and this was in the 80s, who got a note from someone in one of his classes that basically the note from this other person that this other male student wanted to pursue a relationship with my friend. My friend, he was my roommate, actually, one of my roommates. I never had any indication from him that he experienced much same-sex attraction. He eventually went on to marry a woman, and I have absolutely no indication that, but who knows? I mean, because especially when you're young, stuff is weird, and you do stuff, and you don't know why you do stuff. So a lot of people find this kind of thing unsettling, and I think part of the blessing of the gay liberation that we have experienced in our society is, I think in some ways we can have a little bit more mature conversation about these things, and productively so. And so I do not look at all of the fruits of gay liberation as a negative thing. There's a lot of stupidity in the old discriminatory systems, and I'm glad that it's gone. Now, I think we're doing some other things that we're going to not like the consequences of either. But figuring out all of this, I don't think there's any other way to go about it than to work through it as we go. Now, of course, that last question has crossed my mind as a homosexual Christian called to celibacy. But I've rejected that anger. And I think that's wise of you. Because I've been blessed to live in a time when there was enough people in the church so that I am not isolated. But if I lived 100 years ago, I'm not sure I would have remained a Christian because of the isolation that I would have experienced. Absolutely. I also know Christians who are same-sex attracted in a much more repressive culture, I'll say it that way, that chose celibacy because they were taught that it was wrong, and actually find a lot of the current liberation offensive because they did the hard thing. And now others are, doing the wrong thing. This is an enormously complex thing. And part of the problem that we have is we're only hearing certain voices from it. The last time the Christian Reformed Church talked about this at Synod, 2016, some of the strongest voices at the CRC were individuals who are same-sex attracted and said, yeah, I'm same-sex attracted. I choose to believe this is sin, And by struggling with this, I have grown to become a strong Christian. And to take this away is shortcutting the spiritual development of others. So that's why this is so enormously complex. But of course, I do not want to throw away the archetypal standard of marriage you laid out in your 3-hour BMF. So do you think that if I attempt to make the case to my peers that condemnation is not how we should orient ourselves towards homosexuals? The Christian Reformed position is that condemnation is not how we should orientate ourselves towards homosexuals. That is the Christian Reformed position. Because not only was there the 73 report, there was a report, I think, in 98, and I think in 2002. And that also comes through in the human sexuality report. But the difficulty is that those reports adopt a merciful posture and a posture of to whatever degree within the confines of the traditional Christian position, as much accommodation as we can possibly give. And that's what the human sexuality report tries to do. But in this political climate, that report is hated because of the equality justice side of it. So it's just going to be so much pain. So do you think if I attempt to make the case to my peers that condemnation is not how we should orient ourselves towards homosexuals and use my testimony to strengthen the case, will it go over well? Probably. Will it be convincing? You're up against a multi-billion-dollar industry that has so deeply formed almost all of us, we can't possibly know the extent of it. I think it's best to share your story and the truth as you see it. And I think if you do it with integrity, people will listen. And I think that's the best we can do. And so, again, next week when this individual comes on my channel, I might post it on Tuesday. I don't know. Depends how many videos I make this afternoon. This is what we should do with each other. We should tell the truth in love. And we should listen to each other and consider it data. Because we're all instantiations of all kinds of spirits. And we have to weigh these and test these. And finally, what we need to do is decide for ourselves. I believe that someday I will be called to give an account for how I have engaged all of the spiritual forces that have been subjected to me and how I have responded to them. And part of that is sexual. And so part of what life is, whether we think about this in terms of a next life, or we think about this in terms of sort of the secular analogy of this, which is what we call the right side of history. We act. And that's what's important. And speech is part of that. And so, to the degree that you trust your classmates and that they are mature, share your truth with them in appropriate settings. And it sounds like you've got a good community around you, and you've got good friends around you. What a blessing that is. And yeah, if you're able to not get angry, what a blessing that is. And to respond to your classmates in love, what a blessing you give them. And because in many ways, your classmates will care much more about what you have to say than what Dr. Leibold says. That's the way our culture is now. I feel that God is calling me to do something with the student body, which I love, one that he has blessed me through, but I'm still hesitant. I can understand your hesitation. And so I would, if I were you, you have wise parents. I met them. They're lovely people. I'm sure you have wise adults in your school that you can be open with and get advice from and get wisdom from. Do that. And it's not a bad thing to do scary things that you feel called to. That's why I do this YouTube channel. But it is scary and there is hazard. But it's what God calls us to do. He calls us to pick up crosses. He calls us to follow him. So I think sharing your story could be a very powerful thing in your school. But not everyone will receive it well. Just like not everyone receives what I have to say about any particular thing well, much less this very contentious topic today. So God bless you. And whatever you decide, you're the one that gets to make the call. Nobody else. Nobody should pressure you to do it one way or another. Make the decision, seek wise counsel, and maybe the adults around you will create an appropriate venue for the conversation. You know, it sounds so hackneyed. We need to have a conversation. And as long as the conversation isn't just, these are my talking points that I wish to force down the throat of my adversaries. No, a conversation is what we have on this channel. We talk back and forth. We listen. We learn. We love. We also speak the truth as we see it and know it. So, yeah, God's blessing. All right, last question. Is not having children considered a sin? No. It's not a sin to not have children. Children are a blessing. But like all other really big blessings, they're also a challenge. Having children is one of the great privileges. It's not a right. It's a privilege. And it's a responsibility. And I think back to who I was and what I knew when we were having our kids. You know, it's you know, as a man. So, and my experience of it and my wife's experience of it was very different. I mean, so she wanted to start having kids earlier than I did. And, well, you know, I won't go into all the gory details, but, you know, it was about, we were married in 88 and our first child came around in 91. And of course, for the woman, she's experiencing it very early on, whether it's morning sickness or all the other things of pregnancy. And, you know, it's kind of mysterious as a husband. You feel this baby ripple under her belly. And this woman that you marry is now being transformed by this child. And then we had our first child in the Dominican Republic. And then suddenly, I've known babies, you know, but now this is mine. And now the baby has schedules and needs and then they grow and they develop and they have struggles. And now I have All my kids are in their 20s. One just turned 30. It's rich. It's meaningful. It's challenging. It's terrifying. So my youngest son just packed up the car yesterday and drove back to college. And me and my wife are in the driveway tearing up. And at that time, only one of our other daughters was home. And so I called her in and said, come here, I need a hug. And then my wife saw that too and got a hug too. And started to cry. But children are not for everyone. And it's absolutely okay Jesus and Paul were single, but children are a blessing and they're a challenge. Like, they can break your heart, but think about C.S. Lewis and what he says about hearts. If you don't want your heart broken, put it in a little box, tuck it away, never give it to anyone. Don't give it to another human being, or it might get broken. But of course, this is, read the book of Hosea. Ephraim, Ephraim, my son. But again, Christianity is a very optimistic religion. We believe that all of this suffering cannot compare to the glory that will be revealed. And that glory is magnified and intensified by and because of the suffering. That's the Christian faith. So it's a great question. Not having a child is not a sin. By no means. Not everyone should have children. It's not for me to decide who should and who shouldn't. But that's my thoughts. Well, that's today. Any comments by anybody in the voice chat that anybody wants to make? Follow up on anything?
What occurred to me, Paul, was the connection between what you were saying about condemnation of gays and the I think it was the did Vervaeke turn PVK into a non-theist, where you were talking about the fact that Jesus has a great reputation and the church fails to live up to it, and the connection between those two things, right? There's that middle ground of, well, there's the ideal, but the fact that we fail to meet the ideal doesn't mean we need to be condemned because we all fail to meet the ideal.
Right. And Christianity, this is going to get some people excited. There's a weird thing in the New Testament of, there's definitely a universalist undertone in the New Testament. A CRC pastor once wrote a couple of books about that, called it Biblical Universalism. And again, I'm not a universalist, but part of what Christ does in Reformed theology wrestles with this stuff, things like limited atonement. But part of, and I think a lot of this has to do with the language and the limitation of language. Jesus' death and resurrection saves the world. Well, what do we mean by that? It saves the world from sin. What is sin? Missing the mark. And so, what do we mean by saved? I mean, none of us can. All of these words in some ways fall short as compared to the reality that these words attempt to bear witness to. So, no, that's right. These are ideals. We all fall short. Often it's, to get into this whole Vervaeke way of talking, in a strange way, the difference between the actuality and the ideal is potential. And I don't know. I'm sure you have lots of better ways of talking about that than I do, Mark. Anyway, this was today. And I hope whatever it is I had to share with you today was worth your time. I never know. But thank you for your time and attention. You honor me by your presence. And I wish I had more to give each of you as individuals. That's, to me, probably the hardest thing about this whole journey. You know, when you're pastor of a little church, you have time. And I never know what individuals to give my time to. And part of the problem of these great scaling technologies, C.S. Lewis ran into this, of course, is you are all far more worthy of my time than the time I'm able to give to you. And so I believe that somewhere in Christ's generosity and wisdom, this will be made up for in the age to come. So you humble me by your time and attention and your presence on this Discord server that I've not been very present with for a while. There's a whole bunch of messages I haven't answered yet. That's nothing compared to my Facebook Messenger that I haven't looked at in months. And it's just like people message me and it's like, I don't know what to do with all of this. I don't like just putting up a wall, but I don't know what to do with all this. So here in Sacramento, potentially Monday night, we're going to do a meetup here at Living Stones from 7 to 9. Yeah. And well, maybe we'll practice the estuary protocol. Like this morning I posted the first model meeting, and we might have, John has 3 estuary host support network groups. So we might do 3 of those, let's say. We just want to give people a sense of what's possible with a group of people and conversation. So thank you all for your time and attention. Go ahead, Rick, you can end transmission.